Europe, so therefore he rubbed elbows with royalty, and they were always very friendly, very nice, very down to earth. And Margarita and her husband told my father one day in April, or the end of March it was, in 1930, "You have 2 weeks to get out. They're going to kill you, Dr. Kueppers, and leave everything behind. Don't allow anyone to know what you're doing. Don't even say goodbye to your relatives, because that'll tip them off." So they came over on a ship called the Bremen, and they arrived. They were supposed to arrive in Nebraska, and as fate would have it, when they came here to America, to Ellis Island, the people that represented them in Nebraska said, "We don't want the responsibility." And then they were told, "You have a choice of New York or Baltimore." And my father chose Baltimore because they had what they called Deutsches Verein. They were a very elite group of businessmen, scientists, and so on. So that's how he
came. Would be the German association.
But they were, of course, not anti-Nazi, and also, but they helped each other out.
Yeah.
So I mean, you could get rent for. This was during Depression. You could get rent for $1 for a month, just as a token thing. Yeah.
What was the last name, the family name of your father?
Kueppers. It was in German. It's spelled K-U with an umlaut, P-P-E-R-S, but we spelled it K-U-E-P-P-E-R-S.
New spelling,
yeah.
What was the area that he specialized in? Was he an engineer? Was he a physicist?
He was an engineer. He was a physicist. He had about 6 doctorates, I found out later.
Do you remember the particular areas that he was a specialist in? Just if you do happen to remember them, it will be interesting.
He used to always say, "I'm just a draftsman at Glen L. Martin Company," but he was also a physicist. He was a nuclear physicist. I found out later that he designed the mathematical formula for bringing the astronauts back. He also designed the timing mechanism on the atom bomb. He also worked with the men for the electrical system on the miniaturization of the equivalent to the American Sputnik. You know, the Russians, of course, had a larger one, but we had the one that was the size of the grapefruit. I remember he worked on that. He also worked in mind control. He worked in Project Blue Book, and he used to say, it's not Blue Book. He says Black Book is the important one. And I found out many things that he did, including working with aliens and on the moon and in the moon.
During his time in Germany, do you remember, how old were you when you left Germany? Do you remember the particulars? Was he working for a university? Was he working for a research facility? Or was he working for his own private business, electrifying the castles of European nobility?
He worked for himself, but somehow he knew Werner von Braun over there. He knew who he was. He worked with V-2 rockets also. He worked with Glen L. Martin Company over here in America, in Baltimore, as a matter of fact.
Do you remember what particular field was he working in at this company?
At Glen L. Martin? Yeah. When he came to America, he worked as an electrical engineer. That's what he said to us. But then he would disappear, and I wouldn't see him for months and months. Sometimes he'd come home only twice a year.
When he was disappearing, was he just working day and night at his company nearby, or was he leaving the town and going elsewhere?
We always knew where he was. He was just out of town, and only my mother would know exactly where he was in case one of us got sick or something. One of the projects he worked on was in Montauk in Long Island, because he lived in Farmingdale, and he worked there for several years for RCA.
Has he discussed, I know it's very rare and people that work on such projects really discuss with their family what exactly they're involved in. but do you remember any clues from him that actually he was involved in very special, very advanced projects at the time?
Yes, I do, because he used to talk to me when I was maybe a very little child. He talked to me like I was 25 or 30 years old, and he would always say, pay attention, remember what I say, because later on in life you will need this information. So he says, just allow it to go into your mind and think about it. And then he says, when you're ready, he says, you'll probably be around. He always just said, he says, when you're around 55, it'll all come back to you.
Very interesting. I'm just trying to figure out for myself whether he may have been involved in some super secret German projects behind the surface of his official work at the electrification company. Because some of the researchers in Germany that were working on these projects were moved to the United States even before the things got very serious in Germany due to the Nazis. Einstein was, well, he officially emigrated, but I have a feeling that some of these researchers have been moved to the United States with a tacit cooperation of the American and the German government. Do you have a feeling that this could have been the case?
Yeah, I do. The more and more I think about it, because I was born in 1935, and I was born in Baltimore. I'm American. I was born here. When he was working with the Glen L. Martin Company, I remember it was such secrecy, always secrecy, and we were never allowed to speak on the phone, write letters, etc. But I remember a letter, very important letter, and my mother showed it to me. I was very, very small. It might have been, who knows, but at the beginning of the war. I'm not really sure time-wise. And she showed me the letter, and she held it over a big coffee can. And she says, do you see this letter? And I said, yes. She says, I want you to always remember it. It was handwritten by Goering. Goebbels, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Goering. It was Goebbels. And he was, I believe, the foreign minister. Or
the minister of propaganda.
Yeah, right. But he wanted my father to work for him even then. He wanted him to work on the V8, V2 engines and so forth. But my mother read this letter to me, and I was so impressed at this. He was very kind, and he asked my father to please join him, etc., etc. My mother said, my father, she says, Daddy told me that I should read this letter to you, and that I should say to you that this is a momentous occasion. And then she set a match to it, and it went into the coffee can.
You were in America?
Oh, yeah. I was in Baltimore, and she says, if we don't burn this, she says, with the kind of job that your father has, we'll all be killed.
Was the letter, did the letter arrive through probably some secret channels to your father, not through the official post, I suppose?
All I know is the letter. That's all I remember. I don't remember if it was just mailed to the house or what. I have no idea. But then again, it had to be right before World War II. Otherwise, how else could the letter have gotten there?
Very interesting. Let me reiterate the last question, because what I kind of begin to suspect following the following the life stories of several famous German scientists, we all know about Operation Paperclip and several other secret operations that were going after the end of the Second World War, where Allies were scrambling for every German engineer, scientist, and technician they could lay their hands on. The headhunters were combing Germany, especially the underground establishments, and trying to figure out who worked where and to round and cart all these people to the United States. But this happened after the war. I have a feeling that the most important scientists were moved to the United States before even the war ended. Remembering the story of Wilhelm Reich, the inventor of the orgone energy and one of the first methods for mind control, using particular sexual practices or his orgone energy hardware. He was moved to the United States in 1942, several years before the war ended. Obviously, the elite here realized that he's too precious to risk him being killed in the last in the last 2 years of the war in Germany. We also know that the American elite has been secretly in collusion and cooperation with the Germans, and even has been financing him. I mean, Wall Street was the chief financier behind the rise of Hitler to power in the Nazi Party, and major American industrial interests have had close cooperation with the German industry all throughout the war. So the higher we go up in this hierarchical level of conspiracies, the more we realize that basically the American secret government, the American ruling elite here, they were almost the best buddies with the German ruling elite. And many of these secret projects that are run in different feuding countries, in Russia, the United States, and Germany, before or after the Second World War, the general public thinks that these are the most bitter possible enemies, but at these higher levels they become probably the best possible friends, or on quite good speaking terms, because all these projects, in my opinion, are coordinated and orchestrated by management hierarchies that go beyond the terrestrial level, that go into the extraterrestrial and the celestial level. So they are very skillfully coordinated in all the major superpowers in the feuding country, despite the wars that go on as a smoke screen, as a facade. So many of these scientists have been moved back and forth between these projects, and all these projects have been coordinated by this secret hierarchy. Do you remember any clues or any recollections that you may have that may lead to such a notion? I may be totally wrong. This is just a hunch of mine that I have.
You have excellent memory. In fact, it's almost indelible in my mind. My father and mother, especially my father, was extremely good friends with some very elite German scientists who came to our house.
Can you name some?
Yes, I can. I even can tell you who they look like, and I have some pictures in my baby album of some of them, like at my brother's baptism, which was in 1938. So Dr. Nagel was one, Dr. Peiter, P-E-I-T-E-R. Then he had a friend by the name of Wedberg, W-E-D. B-E-R-G, he was in Project Montauk. I know he worked there with him. I'm trying to think of who else. I remember him talking about Tesla. I remember him talking about Einstein.
What did he talk particularly about Tesla and Einstein?
My father had some Tesla equipment, and so when I was small, he had a box about this big, and it looked like a radio. And he put me in a little chair, and he put a box here and a box there, and he put on very high frequency. And I was a very obedient child, but I was, even though at 2 I was not a child, and I was never considered one at home. And being German parentage, very disciplined child, he would say, he put these sounds up higher and higher each time he'd come home, which was seldom. He says, now sit there. And he was very kind, but firm. He says, now, raise your finger when you don't hear the sound anymore. We'll see how you can hear the sound. And he explained to me how animals can hear very high frequency. And he says, maybe I can be able to train you to hear like a dog or an animal. And I would sit there very obediently, a small child, my little ringlets and my little starched dress, and I just sit there very obediently, and I went like this. And that's it. And then he'd give me a reward, you know, going on a streetcar ride or go to the museum or something. So that was a big deal. I loved that, you know. And then we'd have an ice cream and apple pie, and that was my great reward with my father, my pleasure to help him.
So he was training you with his Tesla equipment to hear some high audible frequencies. Do you remember him talking something, commenting something about Tesla, anything about projects that Tesla was working on?
He would, when I was around, let's say around 8, I remember looking, I don't know if this was Tesla, but I remember I looked at a reward that he had gotten from RCA Company as being a wonderful participant or engineer or whatever they called him. I don't quite remember, but I can tell you what it looked like. It was brown in background, and I still have it. I mean, I personally have this award that proves in 1943 what he did. And I said, Daddy, what did you get this reward for? And I said, why don't you hang it downstairs? He says, no, people shouldn't see that. And I said, well, what is this for? He says, it was an experiment in time. And I said, but what's that? He says, maybe you won't understand. And I said, try me. But remember, I had the conversation in German. So he got a cigar box, and he put some, he was sawing away, and he got some steel filings. And when he got the steel filings, he put them in the box, and he taped a big magnet, a big U-shaped magnet underneath, and he started tapping it. I saw concentric circles in this box. And I said, what is that? He says, it's, you know, the magnetism. He showed me on the 2 circles that were perfect. He says, you see that? He says, it's not what you see in life, it's what you don't see that's important. And I said, well, what about time? What does this have to do with it? And he thought that was a very good question, because you never questioned my father when he was in the middle of a conversation. He was one of those guys. And he took an ashtray here and another ashtray here. So he moved this ashtray to this side. And he said, he showed me how time could move from one spot to the other. And I remember certain things, because my mother's birthday was August 12th, and he always brought her a big bouquet of flowers. And I said, oh, Daddy, isn't it wonderful that you're honoring my mother on August 12th? He says, it's not only your mother I'm honoring. So I'm wondering if there was a connection, you see, with the time in the Montauk. It's just like it's all adding up with the Montauk Project.
Maybe it was some special secret day or event of theirs.
It was August 12th was when the Montauk Project came into being with the Philadelphia experiment.
What year was that?
In 1943.
Maybe he was celebrating the event every year.
Yeah, every year.
The anniversary of the event. Very interesting, fascinating. Do you remember him talking something about Tesla or Einstein?
Oh, yeah. He talked about Einstein, and he said what a good man he was. And he says a lot of people think because we're scientists that we don't believe in God. He says, of course he believes in God, but not in the same frame of mind that some people do as an old man with a gray beard. He always talked of it in a form of energy, and he says that's what Einstein thought of. And he always talked about Einstein as such an honorable man, and it was a pleasure to work with him. But I do know he said it was a pleasure to work with him, being part of his team. And that was relevant, that was important.
It's a very interesting comment. So obviously your father worked around the time travel experiments that Tesla was the head of at the Philadelphian project at Montauk. He also worked with Einstein. Do you remember him mentioning other German prominent scientists here in the country, or any other particularly interesting projects that he was involved with?
Some interesting ones. For instance, he talked about Von Neumann as being such a brilliant man. He did talk about him. Oddly enough, since I have this indelible memory, I was very small. I think this was before 1939, so I had to be 3, maybe 4. Now, since I was very well behaved, I was gladly invited by all the elite friends that my parents had, because I was very proper and I was very quiet. And I listened politely. We went to a man that I still think was Von Neumann, because he was Dutch, which was a difference in German accents, you see. And I remember details, crazy details, because this man had a humongous jar of like a butter bonbons, we call it, candies.
Yeah.
And he had a habit of eating these butter bonbons, and he gave me some. And I remember my father working with him, and there was some kind of boxes, and I remember red lights flashing. You know, lights, different type of lights flashing. That's the furthest. I don't know what the experience was, but they were lights flashing.
So, it means that your father took you to his lab.
Yes, and he says, never divulge where I take you. We're going to a special place. And my mother used to get mad. She'd be in the kitchen. She says, you're only taking that child along as a decoy. And he looked at my mother and he says, you're absolutely right.
What kind of a decoy?
Because a father with a child was beyond suspicion, you know, that type.
Do you remember the place that he was taking you to? Was it above ground, underground? How did it look like? And I mean, was it a huge facility? Was it full of hardware and some other strange things?
It was an apartment in downtown Baltimore. It was very dark. I remember going down a dark hall and a door and kind of opening up like it was nobody was supposed to know this guy was there. And my father said, this man is a bachelor, and to be very quiet, not to ask any questions, and be very polite and sit. He says, I'm going to do the talking, and I want you to be quiet. So when my father said that, that was absolutely so. I mean, I could have sat there 4 hours and not moved. But I did have my bonbons, and I was fascinated by the lights flashing. And that's what I can tell you, truthfully. I remember I might have been 3.5 or 4, but I saw there were like bulbs and lights flashing, and I said, what is this for? He says, a lot of these equipment is for healing, he said.
Fascinating. So you have a feeling or a suspicion that this guy at this private apartment might have been von Neumann, that your father was meeting.
Yeah. The reason was because I looked in Al Bielek's book, and I remember, of course, I was very small, and I was always careful to study faces because I was the artist in me. And this man had unusually large lips, you know, and but he had a Dutch accent. And my father says, well, if you understand German, you can certainly understand what he's speaking, and it's Dutch. And I did, because it's like a half English, half German. So I do have that memory.
Very interesting. This is another line of pursuit that I've been following in the last year or so. Namely, I've realized for myself that a lot of secret projects, black projects, are financed not even by the government but by the bankers. And actually, these are the most interesting projects. Shady financiers rent faraway places where crazy scientists pursue ideas that would not be possible to pursue in any academic or even maybe secret government establishment, because in this way technologies are arrived at that are 50 to 100 years ahead of even anything that the government has, and this is one of the best ways to keep the secrecy on these things. So projects about rejuvenation, about healing, even projects, I wouldn't be amazed that the bankers would be involved in projects about immortality. I mean, if I were one of the elite with all the money in the world, literally sitting on a Cheops pyramid of gold, of course I would invest most of my money into projects of immortality. And how are these projects run? In exactly this way. Small, unobtrusive apartments or farmhouses or whole private plantations, unlimited financing, and the best minds of the planet are pursuing these goals.
I have some things to add. You were asking me about other scientists. Suddenly, this opened up an avenue, and several ones. One was a Dr. Kerala, K-E-R-L-A. I can't remember his first name, but in Germany, the Germans are very formal. You don't just say Fred or Harry.
They use the last name.
Dr. Carlo, or Dr. this. Now, this man, we went over to his house, and interesting enough, he had an ordinary house from the front, but he had not only a basement, he had a sub-basement, which he dug out, which nobody else did in the neighborhood, which I thought was unusual. And he says, come, I'll show you my secret projects. And he did. He showed us all kinds of stuff, everything from creams to powders. And I remember he said, see that in the corner? And I said, what is that? I mean, I've been maybe 4 or 5 years old. I'm little, you know. And he says, that's a keg of dynamite, you know, things like that, or gunpowder. And he had all kinds of stuff. And I tell you who backed him. It was Grover Cleveland's grandson. Backed him, had a lot of money.
Who is Grover Cleveland?
He was the president of the United States at one time, but it was his grandson that backed all his projects in Baltimore, and this man became very wealthy from this man who just backed him.
So basically this scientist, Dr. Carlo, was working on, he was a chemist and was working on chemical compounds?
All kinds of chemical compounds that he was inventing. One of them was with a large paint company. He invented the paint, I think that was the predecessor of what you put on garage floors so that the paint would not wear out, things like that. He did a lot of creams and powders and things like that. And you were talking about certain powders. I remember we didn't drink, but we had occasionally a glass of schnapps or something, and there was like gold flakes in this one particular drink called Kölnisches Goldwasser, which was a popular, tastes like Kimmel, you drink it. And I said to Daddy, I said, oh, look at the beautiful sparkles. And he says, well, he said, the gold is a cure. It's a cure-all for a lot of things if it lodges in your liver or different parts of your body. It cures us all kinds of diseases. But he says, you're looking only at gold. He says, the real answer is in a white powder chemical compound, you know, which is what they call the philosopher's stone. So I knew about that when I was very small.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, we all know that philosopher's stone, this is the secret toward immortality. Some chemical agent that can be produced in any chemical lab with repeatability and predictability that affects our immune system, and probably this trigger mechanism in our immune system that is triggered to respond after 40, 50, 60, 70 years, whatever the average lifetime for the generation is, to start slowly destroying, basically it's kind of an autoimmune response where the body, the immune system of the body, the police forces of the body attack their own organism. When the timer of the body says, hi, it's time to leave the scene of this incarnation and make some place for the next waves, next cohorts of generations that are coming. But through an introduction of a simple chemical agent, one can probably stop the aging process and if not totally stop it, then at least largely increase the lifespan. And of course this is a project that all mighty people with money, all bankers and financiers and mighty governments have been involved with secretly ever since time immemorial. I mean, the doctors in the Kremlin hospital, a few blocks down from the Kremlin, have been doing advanced rejuvenation on the ailing heptagenarian and octogenarian Politburo members of theirs. So I wouldn't be amazed that there have been a totally unknown, very little talked about line of research in Germany pursuing the secrets of immortality.
I happen to have two interesting cousins that would interest you in Germany. One is a remarkable businessman who owns the equivalent of Kraft mayonnaise, for instance. An interesting story there. But the woman...
I'm very sorry. Can I ask you to speak a little bit louder just in case to have a better recording?
Okay, and the woman, my other cousin, of course, I'd say 95% of my family's dead because of the war or its repercussion. But this is Dr. Professor. Can I use her name or not? She's living now.
Well, it's up to you.
Well, anyhow, I'll call her Ruth,
yeah.
my cousin Ruth. But she is a doctorate. She is in the East Zone in Germany, but now that the walls are down, I'm sure everything is pretty safe. She was the head nuclear physicist of East Germany, and quite a remarkable woman. She never had any children. And I asked her one time, I said, send me a card of where you work, thinking, or, you know, where you live, where you work, whatever. And she showed me a picture of a castle. So she was the dean of this. And interestingly enough, her husband is, or was, the head of the KGB in East Germany. But I never...
The head of the Stasi police, the Staatssicherheit, the state security forces, the Stasi.
But I was so scared I never did meet her, you know, and I wanted to, but I never did. When I went over there in '85, I thought, oh my God, I don't want people following me the rest of my life and the whole rest of the story. But it was only, you know, family kind of things. If I wrote to her, you know, how is this cousin, how's that one, or whatever little family things that go on in the family, was nothing, no big deal. I refused to ask her anything, and she never did. It was just, she's just a wonderful person, but a remarkable family, I think, to have these kind of people in it, you know.
So it's fascinating because the more we talk here, the more I realize that this is quite a serious. Your father has been a scientist of major, many important key secret projects. Probably he was involved in Germany in similar projects. And he must have been a very brilliant scientist and engineer. Because the more we speak here, the more we realize that he was a member, a part of basically the most important black projects of the time. By the way, you mentioned that he had 6 doctorates. Do you remember what particular areas were they, or what universities in Germany they were from?
I know he was in the University of Berlin, and I remember a huge diploma. It was one of these huge things, you know. And I said, I want you to see this, and I'll only show this to you once, that's all. He never liked to brag about what he did, and he wanted the neighbors to address him as Mr. Kueppers because he was very understated, especially because he didn't want anything to happen. I know that he had a doctorate of physics, and then it was a doctor of engineering, and you know, it was one doctorate after another. I can't remember all of them. Several, and he had several other diplomas. He's got a whole cupboard full of diplomas that he had. And
do you keep some of these still? It will be very interesting, probably on the next show, to put them in front of the camera. Just
I don't have them with me. My brother has them, and he refuses to give them up.
Huh. Would he make a color Xerox of them, or just a Xerox of them?
Talk to him personally. He doesn't. He never had a good rapport with my father, because my father and I were close, and my father really never talked to my brother much, and that was a bad tear in our family relationship. And so, but we have them. I know they're physically obtainable.
Fascinating. So this is right about the time before and during the war. Can you tell us what happened after the war, and whether you had some clues, about your father working on some projects? I mean, anything, even little happenings around the kitchen table, or little words, drops, or hints, or here and there, that would help you build the bigger picture.
Yeah, I remember, even when I was in grade school, he showed me a book I can't think of the man's name now, maybe you can help me out, he was the first one to work with flying saucers. You know the name.
We're talking about the German person?
I think it's a Russian name, but he wrote the first book on flying saucers.
Could this be Tsiolkovsky? No. He wrote a lot of books on aeronautics in beginning of this century.
I can't think of the name right away, but anyway, it's a name that's a popular name with a flying saucer.
Well, I know several German names: Schriever, Habermo, Miete, an Italian Belonzo.
Anyhow, to get on with the story, it's a book that is popular even today, and you know it's pretty popular. But I can't think of. I keep saying Anovsky. I can't think of the man's name, but anyway,
it will pop out.
Yeah, it'll pop out. Anyway, he knew him personally that wrote the book, and he was talking to me about flying saucers, that there was other life, and that he worked on it, and he talked about Project Blue Book and Project Black Book, and then he used to say, I had to represent some scientists, and he says I had to go to talk to Truman, and he used some phrases that weren't very kind, let's put it that way, because he had no use for some of the things that Truman had done.
Would you please speak again a little bit? Would you please speak again a little bit higher?
He was not pleased with some of the attitude that Truman had with scientists. In other words, you know, you can blow up mankind. That's just to prove that America is great. But he says, you know, like he's the president of the United States, and he could give a damn less what the scientists thought. And my father says you're going to annihilate a lot of people. But Truman, you can't reason with him. He was like it was like a person that was uneducated, that was just no reasoning, no politeness, no finesse. It was just a very tough guy to work with.
A bulldozer, the American Khrushchev. Oh, this is exactly, I mean, the perfect guy that the ruling secret evil elite would pick up for a president. A guy that would follow blindly, obey orders without thinking, without even possibly understanding what the subtle things are about.
So the scientists were not pleased with him. And you said I should think of some of the things that were said at the kitchen table. And I remember I was in my teens, and I happened to have a very momentous lunch with my father. We sat there, and I remember the dogs, the Russian dogs that were sent into space, and there's two little dogs. And
the Belka and Strelka, the first two dogs that went into space.
So I've got the time just about right. We heard it on the radio because we didn't have TV. We weren't allowed to have television at home, by the way.
Oh, that's very interesting. Why so? Do you remember any reasons given by your father?
Very simply, he says people who watch television too much, he says you can't learn if you just have a distraction. He says it's just a distraction, good to be used for news or certain things, but not to be distracted. He says it ruins your mind, becomes pudding up there.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what I've discovered by my own television. The moment I cut out the cable line and I don't watch television for several months, I'm getting extremely happy and satisfied with my life. So back to the topic about certain such special events.
Right. So we were sitting having lunch, and I heard on the news, like we all sat there in silence and in awe, that these dogs were going up, and it was so fascinating. So we were all celebrating with the Russians, and I said, Daddy, you're so happy with the Russians. He says, we're all good friends. We all love each other. He says, the scientists, he says, you don't mix minds with politics. He says the minds are all the same. We all work together. So anyhow, I said, but what's going to become of the dogs? And he said, the last meal they eat, they will be poisoned. And I said, But Daddy, I said, if this is a preliminary of what people are going to do, are they going to kill off the astronauts? It's like, goodbye, Charlie, you know, this is the end. It's nice knowing you. You've done a lot for your country, but the last tuna fish sandwich you have, this is it. You know? And he says, he put his knife, and he's a very serious man, put his knife and fork down, looked at me, and said, yes, something can be done about that. And I said, can you? And I started to cry, and I said, Daddy, I don't know what you do, but can you do something about it to bring those dogs back? Because if you do, then I said, the astronauts can come back. I said, I think it's stupid what they're doing. And he says, you're right, stupid. And he got up, forgot what to eat, he went upstairs, and he started to work on some books and papers and stuff. And that was the last, and I never asked him about it again, see? And I found out many years later that he was the one that devised the mathematical, or one of the ones, you know, I never know if it's the one or the one that was working on it, that brought the astronauts back, the mathematical formula for bringing it back. Because I said, Daddy, but they can get them up there. He says, any idiot can bring them up there. He says it takes someone that's got some brains to bring them back. He didn't mince words much.
Do you remember him talking about some German space exploration using some of the existing rockets? Any hints or clues about such research in Germany before and during the Second World War that was related to taking a person into space?
Yeah, he was talking about working with rockets, and he'd say they test small ones. You know, he would test small ones, and that you could get a rocket into space. You know, and he was talking. What did he say? There was something else. It just slipped my mind. There was an experiment that was done on me. All right, this is the German science. That when my mother was 6 months pregnant, I found this out. My mother was angry at my father. They always had heated arguments. And she said one day, she said, oh, if you're so crazy about your daughter, why don't you tell her that you wanted to have her aborted at one time? And he says, what the heck what the hell are you talking about? You know, I love my daughter. Why would I want her aborted? And she says to me in a very cruel way, she could be very lovely, but she could be very cruel, and in anger, she said, your father had a rod inserted in me when when I was 6 months pregnant with you to get rid of you. And he put it was always at the dinner table, put his knife and fork down, and he says, don't you realize, he says, that had nothing to do with it. He said, if she, he says that was to improve what we already had, to improve the package that we already had. So Dr. Hase, which was my mother's friend and family physician, which was also a German, I don't know if he was a scientist or not, but he was a German gynecologist in Baltimore, well known, inserted this rod in my mother before I was born. And I believe it was an experimental type of thing to enhance psychic abilities or improve IQ.
Did they leave this rod there to stay to the end of the pregnancy, or it was inserted and then removed immediately?
No, it was inserted, and she had to wear it several months.
Very interesting, very interesting. Any other recollections of the 50s and 60s? When did your father die? What year was that? Supposedly in
April, on Lincoln's birthday in 1962. My last conversation with him was around Christmas of 61.
Do you remember anything particular about during the 50s and 60s? For example, when the Russians started shooting the Sputniks up, and Gagarin flew on 12th of April 1961, so it was before the death of the father. Do you remember him commenting something about space exploration, or about possibly that we have already been in space, or something to that end?
He's already said, he says, we've already been there. He says, this is nothing but a damn act. And he did say to me in 1956, he was working in Colorado at the Martin Marietta Company to come to see him, so which I did. And in order, so we didn't drive, and neither did he. In order to do this, he said, for me to take a bus, city bus, he set me up in a hotel room, but to the end of the line in Golden, Colorado, okay? And he says, it's only 13 cents. So I said, okay, 13 cents, end of the line, Golden, Colorado, and I was to meet him for lunch. So there he was at the end of the bus, exactly the time. He was always like clockwork. And he says, now we've walked to where I work. And I said, that's the Martin Marietta Company on top of that hill, which was a big flat, like a one-story white building that nothing looks like a factory. I said, why doesn't it say Martin Marietta? He says, it's not supposed to. So we walked up there, walked up the hill, went inside, went to the elevator, and pressed the elevator. There was nobody around, and went down about 7 stories. My ears were popping and things like that. I said, where are you taking me, you know? And he says, oh, to my office. I want to show you my office. So I went down there, past security guards, and as I went, he says, I'll take you to my boss's office. Now, I was at least 7 stories or a little more, I don't know, down, and on the office walls I saw 4 to 6 pictures, a series, and they had like a big, it was a artist rendering. It had a nice matte, you know, like it was a hot, well, almost the color of this, like a hot red, beautiful artist renderings. And the artist renderings, this is in 56 now, was the space shuttle of today, the stealth bomber of today, men on the moon, men on space stations, things like that kind of thing. And I thought, well, you know, I didn't figure there's anything secret. If they're going to have it exposed on the guy's wall, they'd certainly have it in some kind of classified filing cabinet. But I found out the other day that, of course, if it was that highly secret, it would be down there. It really wouldn't matter, but that was highly secret. So I went, and I didn't know, and he didn't know he wasn't supposed to take me there. So I went through there, and I happened to see his desk. Everything was off the desk, no papers, nothing on it. It was all gray, dark gray, in a gray cabinet, a locked kind of cabinet. Everything was locked. He says, well, everything's locked. We can go to lunch now. And I said, why are you showing me this? And he says, well, I want you to see how neat everything is, how neat I am. You're always such a slob. He says, you got your artist papers over everything. I want you to see how neat your father is. And it was like a 20-minute type thing, and boom, and I was out of there, and we went to lunch at the Mile High restaurant. I remember that. Now, the interesting thing was, when I came back, I happened to be an artist at the News American, which is now defunct, in Baltimore. I was an artist. And that, like the next day after I came back from seeing my father in Colorado, there's a guy in a trench coat talking to my boss, wondering what kind of an American am I and all. My boss says, what the heck did you do, Helga? And I said, I didn't do anything. And I was only maybe 20, or I don't know, I can't think chronologically, maybe 20, 21, whatever age that was. And he noticed, my boss noticed that there were people always watching me, asking questions after that. And that happened for a long time. I'd see people for years, up until I was pregnant with my daughter. I know, till I was 32, 33, somebody always reading a newspaper, whether it was in snow or the heat or whatever. Could be 140 degrees outside. Somebody's reading a newspaper in a car. And it got to a point, and I used to tell my father that even then. I'd say, what are these guys following me for? And he says, don't worry about it. He said, at least if somebody steals your handbag, you're in good hands. Somebody will help you out, you know. He says, feel safe. Don't worry about it. And I didn't. And I still, to this day, I don't worry about things.
So this is a very fascinating thing. What year was that you saw these drawings? 1961 or earlier? 56. So 1956 drawings. Could this have been kind of a result of a time travel experiment where they went forward in time and saw what would be built 10, 20, 30 years from then? 56 to 1986 when the stealth bomber was built, that's about 30 years. Or could have been that all these projects have been secretly developed 20, 30, 40 years in advance and kept under wraps, and finally when the time comes to pull out the next rabbit out of the hat in order to keep this smoke screen of the Cold War and the competition with the Russian military establishment going, they would just pull in the next machine out of the huge arsenal of available secret weapons and show it to the public as the new and latest invention.
What you just said is what he kind of told me, and I said, what is this stuff on the wall? I said, look at beautiful art. And he said, well, he says, these are projects that are already underway. He says, they always work 20, 30 years in advance. And I said, oh my God, why so far? He says, well, it's so the public doesn't know. So I'm sure that there's some, like you said, the next rabbit out of the hat will probably be fantastic.
So this means that probably they've been working on a space shuttle type system. Well, basically, when did the space shuttle flew? Like the 70s? It flew like the late 70s or something like that. So they've been working 20 years ahead on such a project.
I know that for sure, because I saw those pictures, and the way my father would talk, it was that our country, he always said, was so great. He says that if any country tried to overstep or hurt us, he says, we have so many underground installations and so much going on underground. He says all it would take was a button, and it would annihilate anyone and anything, he said. He says this stuff with communism is a joke between the churches. He says people are so worried and excited it's a smoke screen. So God forbid somebody doesn't believe in God. And he says, who really cares? He says the point is the scientists get along. And he says their technology is there and they work together.
Fascinating. So here I see three interesting issues here. Do you remember how was the shuttle painted? When you say shuttle, obviously it was looking like a shuttle, but was it very same as the shuttle as we know it? Was it?
It was white. But they didn't have it standing up. They showed it in flight, exactly the way it is now.
So it was in flight and no boosters were strapped to it?
No boosters on it.
Were these big hatches of the cargo bay opened or closed?
Closed.
Was it flying in outer space, or was it kind of approaching for landing or something like that?
Well, it was, the pictures inside this were about this big, and then there was a big edge around it. But it looked like it was just there to show the shuttle. I don't remember it going towards the Earth or anything else. It was like in space.
How do you know that it was in space?
Because the way it was painted in the background with the stars and everything.
Oh, I see. What other projects do you remember? Do you remember any bases on the moon or elsewhere on these drawings?
Yes, I would see a man in a spacesuit, and I remember the moon, surface of the moon, which is very obvious, and it was as if they were working on it, like people were working on it, or or like it was not inhabitable, but that people could physically put boxes and gear and things there. It looked like they were putting supplies down or something.
How many people were there on that drawing that you saw?
Two. There's a larger figure in the front, and then there was a smaller one in the back, and they were like putting supplies or something towards the background.
Was there any vehicle visible that transported them there, or?
No, it was just that they were on the surface.
Were dressed in astronaut suits?
Yes, like they were now, the big puffy white ones.
Were there any traces of buildings or any serious dwelling arrangements?
What they had was another picture. The only dwelling that I remember is similar to Star Trek, where they have it looks like a, what do you call that in space, where they have a
permanent station.
A permanent station in space, and it looks very much like the Star Trek type of thing. It was pointed, and then it was a big thing in the back. And
it's like a wagon's wheel, a donut-shaped thing with spokes?
Not that kind. It was like a pointed thing, and then it was like a triangular thing in the back, but it was like hanging in space. And you could see the other ships taking off and going back and forth from it.
How many ships were there visible?
Just small, maybe 2 or 3 on the side. It just showed like they were very pleasantly leaving and approaching.
What kind of ships were these? Do you remember? How were they looking? Like rockets? Like shuttles? Like?
It looked like the space shuttle type thing. It didn't look like oval spaceships.
Was there the Earth visible in the corner of the drawing, or the moon?
Towards the bottom. Like it was hanging, like suspended above the Earth, and then these little ships are going back and forth. And just a little bit of the Earth, you could see just a little roundness on it.
So basically these were drawings of an orbital space station. And your father said that they are working on these things, as a project, or they have developed it?
Already developing it. It's already on the way. It's already being done. And he just casually passed me the toast. It was no big deal.
Fascinating. Pass me the toast, please. Pass me the space station in 1956. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. This is a gold mine of information here, a gold mine. Back to the Bolshevik Revolution, and one of my famous hottest topic of research these days, the rumors that the Wall Street and the American banking and business community financed not only the rise of Hitler and the Nazi power in order to do their bidding in Europe, but they were instrumental in financing the Bolshevik Revolution together with the Vatican and South Africa. The Vatican gave several tens of millions of dollars, $50 million. South Africa gave like $600 million in gold. And Wall Street put up the rest of the money, and this is how the Bolsheviks came to power. Russian Tsarist police generals, one of them, I forgot the name, in his memoirs wrote that there were foreign agents handing out money to workers and, of course, unemployed seamen in Leningrad right before the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were basically hiring up their props for the revolution that was about to be filmed on the next day. That it was a major operation financed by the Western financial interests. But even further revelations are all the way back to the Communist International and Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto, that all these were financed, planned, and orchestrated by the Illuminati, by the leading bankers and financial elite. So back to your father's remark about the Cold War. What was his attitude during the Cold War toward the Russians? You just said some time ago that, well, the Cold War is a smokescreen politics, but we scientists are good friends with each other. Do you remember him mentioning any common projects with scientists, with Russian scientists during the Cold War, behind the smokescreen of the Cold War? Or do you remember him mentioning that, well, maybe this whole Cold War is just a kind of a smokescreen? What was his attitude during the Cold War toward the Russians? You just said some time ago that, well, I mean, the Cold War is a smokescreen politics, but we scientists are good friends with each other. Do you remember him mentioning any common projects with scientists, with Russian scientists during the Cold War, I mean, behind the smokescreen of the Cold War? Or do you remember him mentioning that, well, maybe this whole Cold War is just a kind of a smokescreen?
Yeah, well, I remember he would tell me a story. This was before, all right, this is before he died. And he said he wanted to make sure that I remember things that he's told me. He says it's really important. And he used certain key words that I don't really care to use here. One of the things he told me, he said, always, and he took a walk with me through Guilford, which was an adjoining little village near our house, so we couldn't be followed. He says, I want you to be quiet and just listen to what I have to say, because when you're around 55, he says, you will remember everything that I tell you. Now, why that was, I don't know, but he seemed to feel that 55 was some magic time. He said, I was not only on the moon, I was in the moon. There are bases on the moon. This was in 1961 when he told me this. And he said also that he was on Mars and in Mars. And I said, how in the hell did you get up there? He says, when they don't know how to bring people back and all that other good stuff. He says, that's baloney. He says, it's all taken care of. It's taken care of. And he says, the reason I'm telling you this, I have only, they're only giving me 3 months, and then I will be, you won't see me anymore. I'll be dead. And I said, well, how in the hell can you be dead, Daddy? You're the picture of health. You look wonderful. He says, that's not the point.
How old was he at that time, at 61?
I'd say 70, 71, or something around that. You don't hold me to the year exactly, but 70, 71, something like that. And I said, what do you mean? There's someone going to kill you? He says, well, he says, not exactly. And I said, if you hate my mother so much, why don't you just get a damn divorce? And he said, looked at me in a very shrewd-looking calmness. He had a calmness about him that I've never equaled anywhere. Not a sinister calmness. I mean, just a knowing calmness. He said, that's not necessary. He says, there are other ways. So when I saw, all of a sudden, my mother got a phone call. He went to the hospital for a very routine examination, and that she said that there was a nun. He died in the arms of a nun. So when my mother wanted to send thank you cards to the nun and candy or flowers or what to thank her, no one had any record of any nun in this hospital.
And this was probably the Bethesda Naval Hospital?
No, it was Catholic Hospital, Bonsecours Hospital. However, when he was laid out, now I knew my father very well, there was no hair on his hands. Now, he had hair from here. He used to have it up on his fingers a little and up to here, and then no hair. But here, there was no hair. And when I touched his cold hands, I thought that was strange. And then I noticed these men in trench coats. Now, you know, Germans do not deal much with Americans, especially when all my life everything was secret. So here these guys in trench coats like this with their arms folded all around. There was 2 by the coffin, and there were several others around.
That's inside the
funeral home. And I asked them, I said, who are you? And they looked at each other like they didn't have a good answer. So I said, something told me to say to them, oh, you must be friends from my father with the Glen O. Martin Company. Thank you, I welcome you. And I was just gracious. And they looked at each other and they said, oh, yes, yeah, like I must have put an answer in their mouth, you know. Then I went to his face. He had his hair combed straight back. I went to his face and I brushed his hair. All of this hair moved.
That means that it was a toupee.
I don't think it was my father in that coffin.
So they probably used a toupee to make another corpse look close to your father's corpse.
I don't think it was him. Because in 1985, when I went over there, and my mother paid for the grave and all that stuff, there was no record of him being buried in the family plot after my mother paid. I have physically, personally, I have the receipts. Just not there. It was non-existent. Never heard of it.
So let's back up a little bit. Now this is the most interesting part of the story here. So one more time, I mean, do you remember any instances of him mentioning that basically the Cold War is kind of a smokescreen and that we are in cooperation with the Russians? Or do you remember him saying that the Russians are with us in these moon bases too? Something like that, to that end?
Oh, he said we're together in this whole project. We are together in this project. He says it's not only America, it is Russia also. He says we are together in this project. That is what he said.
Fascinating, fascinating. This is probably the first eyewitness account for me. First-hand eyewitness account of basically the whole line in the alternative 3 scenario, which in my feeling has been a designer leak, an engineered leak by the Illuminati to tell the world that, well, a lot of secret space projects are going on behind the scenes. So your father has mentioned on several occasions that we are together in this whole space business with the Russians. Did he mention the Germans being there together with them, or French or British or the Japanese, the way we see this picture painting in Star Trek, that they are token representatives from all the major world powers?
He seemed to focus mainly on the Russians and the Russian know-how and the German know-how. He says the Americans use the German brains. And he says, I really don't mind because they'd only kill me if I was over there anyway. So he says, and he was very pro-American, I might add that too. But he did say that the Russians is all very friendly. He says, he says, they just have a smoke screen. That was, he didn't use those words, yeah, but that was what it was in it.
Did he mention Germany, the federal West Germany being involved in these projects in the 50s and 60s too, with the Russians and Americans?
Yeah, and he said that he had worked with Werner von Braun at the time. Now, he had no use for him, and neither did the other scientists, because he says, we all worked our asses off, and this man took all the glory. And that was his attitude, and most of the scientists felt that way. And Einstein, he says, was unique because he was a humble man. But he said there were so many of us, he said, we're not seeking glory. He says, you don't seek glory in some of this. But he says this man, that's all he wanted to do was put a name for himself.
Fascinating. So, in 1961, there have been bases on the moon and probably elsewhere in Mars. Have your father spoken anything about the size of these bases? Are we talking about basically a few bedroom little moon base, or are we talking about a huge city-sized establishment or something like that? Any hints to that end?
All I can remember, he said that the areas where they worked in was adequate. I remember the word adequate.
Talking about the moon.
Or Mars, or whatever. And I said, how the hell did you get up there and back? He says, it's beyond your comprehension now. But he seemed to think of some type of time device, you know.
Time travel device. Do you remember this television series, The Time Tunnel, science fiction series for all of the American public, and possibly another designer leak for the few people in the knowing? Do you remember him mentioning anything about teleportation or flying saucers? Because these are the three technologies that the government has been using for half a century. Flying saucers and anti-gravity, number one. Number two is teleportation. from an orbiting ship to the planet, or from a planet to planet. Probably this planet-to-planet teleportation is done by a transmitter and receiver. And the third one is the time tunnel technology that can send anyone anywhere in the universe without a receiving station.
He seemed to tell me, he showed me, I remember his gold ring, and he showed me my hands that we were all consisting of atoms. Now this was, I don't remember what year this was, but he says that if we could take all of this matter and transform it into some type of a beam of light or some type of an energy force, it could be transferred from point A to point B on a beam, some type of beam, and that's all I can remember. But he says this is the way to simplify how it's done. And he says if people only would look at the cartoon called Flash Gordon that we had in the newspapers, all the newspapers, he says that's simply put in there to program people because of what's going to happen in the future.
Fascinating. This technical description on a popular level is the description of teleportation. Moving objects from point A to point B by transmuting matter into hyperspace energy and then recondensing it again at the destination point. So obviously the government has been beyond the usage of saucers, which is very interesting. I've had so far the impression that the Russian-American base on the moon was built by using nuclear-driven huge transport saucers there. But I wouldn't be amazed that this would move further back in time the date Americans landed on the moon with saucers. It could have even been before the Second World War, if the persistent rumors that British landed on the moon with a more crude technology in the 1890s, a rumor that I've been actively investigating these days. So if teleportation is used, then absolutely there is no restriction on the lift capability of a rocket or a flying saucer, and you can literally transfer, I mean, trucks, bulldozers, munitions, cement, bricks, cinder blocks, you name it, you can transfer it through teleportation and build a whole city, build anything there without any restrictions on building materials, on food. I mean, you can just use the same technology and construction the way you see around us, especially if there is atmosphere on the moon and you can breathe that atmosphere easily. The rumor is that you can walk on the moon without a space suit and breathe the atmosphere. If you want to jog, probably you would need some additional extra oxygen bottle with a little tube in your nose. So your father said that there is ample space up there where we work.
Ample, it was adequate. The room, the place where we were, it was adequate. That's all he said. And he says, I don't want to really get into too much, he says, other than it was adequate. And he says, rest assured I was there. And I said, Daddy, and I started to hesitate. He says, remember, he says, I have nothing to lose. I never lied.
Fascinating. I mean, that's very typical in the German tradition. These highest moral values and feelings of honor that the German would have, especially if this such a high-ranking position, a German scientist or an officer. In my kind of cross-cultural perspective on this, it's very similar to the Japanese samurai attitude. A samurai may be killed, a samurai may sacrifice his life for a very little gesture, just to keep his honor intact. So I'm quite willing to take this as the word it is. So back to the living spaces up there. Did he mention anything about the number of people that are there? Just any words that may give out whether we're talking about crew of 5 space station, or 50,000 or 500,000 living on the moon?
I remember him saying he was training aliens, and I said, what do they look like? And he says, like you and I, and they're infiltrating with, this is in the 50s, and he says, these are infiltrating with the natural populace of the country. He says, for instance, I said, how? And he says, well, if there was a farm girl and she would meet this wonderful, handsome stranger, he was also a farm boy, he would be programmed to have a memory of what being a farmer, or from Kentucky, or whatever the heck accent, walk, and thinking of his mother making homemade apple pies or something like that. He says, so he had to train them to think like humans trained. You know, like if their only way of reproducing was in a petri dish, maybe, he would have to show them or tell them how you make love, how you pray, how you eat, how you react with children, how you react with swimming, or whatever we do, or bowling night, or whatever. And this is a crew that he seemed to work with several people that he trusted that did nothing but this.
Train aliens to reside in our civilization. Did he mention where these aliens come from? Were these real aliens, or could these have been some government-cloned beings in a program so secretive that they couldn't even divulge to your father the origin of these beings?
He never got into too much where they came from. He says, rest assured, they just look like ours. I mean, there's some. When I started questioning him, he backed down. If I should have let him talk. But as soon as I started questioning him, he knew that I was intelligent enough to ask him pointed questions, and he didn't want to be boxed in a corner, that kind of thing. And I remember the name of the first spaceships in the books. It just came to me, Adamski. That's what it was.
Oh, George Adamski, yeah.
He knew him personally.
Do you remember his opinion about Adamski? I mean, the party line in American ufology has been trumpeting for years that Adamski is a fraud, that these things never existed. What was his opinion of Adamski as a personality and of his whole contactee experience?
Well, all he did was open the book. He had that book, the first one that came out, and he showed me the pictures of it. He said, now these are pictures that are for the public. He says, this is the closest to what I will show you of what they look like. And the flying saucers in Adamski's book, which anyone can get, even in a flea market you can get these books. That was no big secret. But I asked him, what do the aliens look like? And he said, like you and I.
Did he mention how many aliens have he trained in this way, or for how long this project went on? That was in 1951 or something like that, about the alien training?
That was, when was that he was telling me about the aliens? It was in probably, the late 50s. He was talking about that, late 50s, very late 50s.
So another party line tenet is cracking at the seams here, namely that the little grays were the first one to land on our planet, and they were the first one that we established diplomatic relations with.
No, they look like you and I. And I'd say something like, where are you going to be now? He says, well, I've got to leave. He says, I'm going to work, I'll be working, chasing down UFO things, he said, for the government. And I said, what is that? And I said, it's that Project Blue Book. He says, no, Black Book is the more important one, Helga.
The real project, not the Blue Book, but the Black Book. It's a very interesting distinction here. When a government publishes white papers, the British government's white papers on certain policy of theirs, this is the official party line view, the government view on these things. And in Russia and Eastern Europe, dissidents would publish the black papers on the same phenomena. The Czech Black Book is one of the most famous dissident Czech books that appeared underground about a month after the Russian invasion in Prague, where they put together in this book information from official sources, from the parliament, from fascinating story, but usually, I mean, a black book is the book where the information goes, the most important information. So I wouldn't be amazed that there has been a totally undercover project under the black book and beyond and parallel to the black book. I mean, beyond and parallel to the white book. I'm sorry, to the blue book. That was called the Black Book Project. So, did your father personally train the aliens? Let's say if it is swimming, would he go and swim with them in a pool, or did he kind of not brainwash them, but brain pump them with this information?
Well, he had people work with him or for him, and he was seemed to be the overseer and personally teach them certain things, etiquette, whatever, you know.
So yeah, these were human teachers that would teach them rather than some brainwashing experiments. Did he say for how long would these aliens be on the planet, or he didn't mention anything?
He says they always were.
They always were. Did he mention the government having some official relationships with diplomatic relationships with aliens, or having alien ambassadors? I've heard the rumor that there is a Venusian ambassador living in Washington, and possibly ambassadors from all other civilizations in our solar system. I mean, the rumor is that all the planets are populated. Have you heard anything like that? I mean, I've suspected that not only the American elite, but all the terrestrial government elites have been secretly in cooperation with aliens ever since time immemorial.
Well, I seem to get a feeling that everything seemed to surround Maryland or Virginia or the Pentagon. That was like the key area
of the alien presence.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So, if I may ask again this question, just to finish with the size of the moon operation, do you remember him mentioning the number of people that work up there on the moon in these adequate quarters that you mentioned?
No, he just said that they were there. See, now remember when he talked, I wasn't really allowed to butt in and ask questions, and once I did, he kind of clammed up. So I learned a long time ago to leave that alone. But I do remember him saying he would go through Nevada, especially the Nevada area, and he says there's so much stuff going on underground there. And he said the idiots, he said they had atomic bombs they'd explode, and he says, and they'd have people watching it. And he says the scientists knew not to watch them. He says you'll all be dead of cancer. He says they're such idiots. He says that's not a theater. He says this is serious stuff that they're messing with. Sure enough, as history shows itself, I think most of those people that watched this in fascination are dead now. 500
American soldiers were irradiated with close proximity atmospheric nuclear blast. They were just standing there watching them, some even several hundred meters away from the epicenter. Let's say about a mile away, according to a recent documentary film that I saw personally on television. Fascinating. So, your father said that he's been both on the moon and in the moon. Did he elaborate, I mean, what he meant in the moon? Did he?
They have underground bases in the moon like they have here. That was the idea, or at least that's what it sounded like to me. That so whatever is below the surface seemed to be more important than what was on the surface.
This is a very good metaphoric expression, not only of what's on the moon, but also on what is on this planet, but also of what it is in the policies of this government and in the minds of the evil archy ruling the planet. What is hidden and underground is a lot more important than the smoke screen that is left up front for the public.
I just want to mention something. I've always been psychic. I've been gifted all my life. And I'll lead this part of the conversation into what I really meant to say. He handed me a map when I was a little girl, I don't know, maybe second, third grade. And this was during the war, and I put my hand, he says, "What do you see?" And he's very friendly to me, and I had it on the card table. And then I had my hand over the map. And what had happened was I get this clicking sensation on the edge of my hand. I had a small hand. And then he just says, "Where is it the clicking is?" And he'd go like this, and he'd block out areas. Now, he might have shown me Brooklyn or something, or, to trick me to see what kind of... And I said, "No, there's nothing here." Then he folded it back, and then I'd go to the next map. It was like usually no more than 2 or 3 maps. And that was it, no more. And what it was, I was finding the Nazi underground installations, that kind of thing.
Where?
In Germany, during World War II. And my reward, of course, was apple pie and ice cream after we go to the museum, and that was my big deal. So I did that.
Did he program you probably in your sleep to
be
looking for these installations?
No, natural.
How would you...
Because I see that. I have had out-of-body experiences, and I see that, and I've flown over the countries. I've seen things happen. He knew this happened for some reason naturally to me since probably the first grade.
This is something that we talked about last night, but do you think that he may have been instrumental in uplifting or in developing your supernatural abilities at a very early age with some of the experiments of his that he was doing?
I think a lot with it, the tone, the high frequency, because even now, all of a sudden, I'm driving or I'm in a supermarket, or I can look at a can of cat food or something very innocent. I don't expect these things. All of a sudden, it's like a zombie being tuned in. I hear this loud noise until it dissipates, until it's gone. But I did say this to him during the war. I said, "Daddy," I said, "if you're working on a lot of things for this country," and I had the same great love for America as he has, I said, "why don't you use some of my abilities for the government?" He stopped, he looked at me, he said, "I don't want my beautiful daughter to be used like an animal, like an experiment." He said, "because after they're finished with you, you'll just be killed off."
This is a very good summary of the moral attitudes and values the government has toward its scientists, including the most brilliant ones. They would ruthlessly kill them without any second doubts, just to preserve the secrecy of this project. And this is done not in the best national interest. This is done in the best interest of the evilarchy that is behind the nation. What is good for the evilarchy is good for the nation. To preserve the truth that they have technologies 50 to 100 years ahead of what they are laundering down to us as the latest advances of American science, they would kill anyone. They wouldn't hesitate to killing thousands of people if necessary, just to keep the truth from emerging, because in this way they have a competitive edge that would allow them to become winners of basically any foreseeable situation that happens with them or on the planet. So back to the moon story. So with these adequate quarters to work there on the moon, and you're feeling that these were underground living arrangements, have you tried to visit them with your paranormal abilities and try to verify what he told you? If you were able to find these German underground facilities in Germany?
I had a strange thing happen to me. He died in around Lincoln's birthday in '62. So Memorial Day weekend, I was still grieving, and I was very, very upset about his death. So people told me, oh, watch Steve Allen, do something to laugh or something, because I was really in the pits. So I sat on my bed, which was a couch, a nice long couch, and I was watching with my dog, watching Steve Allen. So nobody was around, no phones, nothing. The bed came down, started to go down. I'm wide awake. The bed started like a weight. And I looked, and my God, there was my father. 3-dimension. I could smell the Mole shave cream on him. He had a suit, very conservative man with a bow tie, little tiny bow tie. And I said, my God, Daddy, I said, I thought you were dead. Now, here, I'm a visionary all my life, so you don't get excited and go crazy and, oh, my God, or anything, or oh, my goodness. And so I touched his knee, and I felt the texture. I felt the texture. And I said, Daddy, I said, are you dead? And he said, I am not dead. I'm in another dimension. He says, don't try to bring me back again unless it's absolutely necessary, because it's very painful for me to come back. But he kept saying, he says, when you're 55, you'll start remembering all the things I told you. He says, remember, I'll always be there when you really, really need me. Now, 4 months ago, I lose track of time a little bit, I asked a certain area, I won't say where I got this information from, to get any of the papers that my father wrote. I didn't care what, if it was about the weather. I didn't care. I just want something. So this party knocked themselves out, and they sent me papers that my father had written. I had a stack, 3 that almost a quarter of an inch. In fact, I'll get them over to you sometime, and so you look at it. Yeah. But the date, it was written by Frederick August Kueppers. The date by this German scientist was between 1978 and 1980. So how in the hell could he have been dead?
And he died in 19...
Supposedly in 62.
80 years after. Do you have a feeling that he works here on this planet in some secret establishment, underground, above ground, in some other country, or they may have opened up and established presence and bases in some other dimension, time-wise or frequency-wise, on the planet, and he may have been transferred there to do whatever work necessary for the government?
All I know is on this, there's an address of the institute and the institution that he worked at or is working at or was working at between 1978 and 80. He would probably be almost 90 then. He was born in 1892. So that would make him, what, in 1978 or 80? How old would that be?
He was born in 1892?
1892.
1892, that's 80 years, and 78 would be 86.
Yeah, so that would make sense. So here, all this work, I thought almost like I was cheated, and I was angry at first. But then I turned around a few days later when I was thinking about it, and I thought, great, he didn't have to get a divorce. If it was staged, it was something probably that he didn't mind doing so he could remain focused on his life or his business or his scientific work. But the price he had to pay was he couldn't see me.
Do you think he told your mother where he was going? Do you think that he contacted her after his fake death?
No, absolutely not.
Do you remember any instances of him mentioning other scientists disappearing, quote, quote, like him in similar fake death experiences? Like stories that I've heard that so many scientists have been given fake crashes in England, scientists that worked on Star Wars and other projects, and they were probably evacuated to the moon and Martian survival colonies. Do you remember any such instances from him?
The only thing I remember is when I said, well, why don't you just get a divorce from my mother? He says, that's not necessary. He says, there are other ways of taking care of if you want to disappear or if you want to leave. And he left it at that. That's all. And the way he said things, it was like you don't ask another question when you talk to a man like him. You kind of surmise, you know.
Fascinating. So a little question back again to the moon underground facilities. Did he mention that this could be the hollow moon, and all these stories that the moon is hollow with some major living facilities underneath? Basically that the moon, I've heard one of the wildest rumors, that the moon actually is a discarded old abandoned battleship, a battle planet that was damaged so heavily in some belligerencies that the aliens who piloted it drove it here and built themselves a second moon and left the first one here and disappeared. Stories supported by experiments done by Apollo astronauts that exploded dynamite charges or crashed heavily into the moon's surface, the discarded and not needed anymore upper half of the lunar landing module after the astronauts returned safely back on board the mothership Apollo, the Apollo mothership orbiting at about 10 kilometers above the moon's surface. So with these disturbance, these explosions on the moon's surface, then the seismographs recorded a response. I mean, this is a normal shock therapy of a of a soil surface, and the moon reverberated for many hours, which could only be true. These vibrations didn't die out quickly, the way it happens with a natural body made of some rock materials. It was ringing like a bell. And the only way for this to be explained mathematically is that the moon is a hollow sphere made of titanium, a hollow hull made of titanium, and full of some living quarters and other arrangements inside. All the dirt and dust we have on the surface are natural accretion of space dust and meteorites that fall with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons every year on every celestial body, the planet, the satellites, anything. So basically the craters on the moon, as we see them, some of them have been made by real meteorites striking the dust heaps on the surface above this titanium hull. The story is that some Russian scientists have noticed that the craters are quite hollow, shallow on the moon's surface. It looks like somebody dropped a drop of water on a thin layer of flour or any dust on top of an aluminum foil. You would have a crater into the layer of flour, but this crater would be very shallow. The ratio between diameter of the crater and the depth of the crater is kind of strange for the moon. They are too shallow for the large diameter. This could as well have been some of these craters could have been made by huge beam weapons being aimed at the moon, and that's probably how the moon got, according to this story, according to this rumor, that the moon was basically almost destroyed in a battle, and they had to abandon it and build a second ship. Old legends about two moons circling the Earth at a particular time could have been just legends about the time when the second moon was being prepared and they were transferring equipment, what they could salvage from the first to the second. But anyway, this is just a wild rumor. But measurements, seismographic measurements of Apollo program seismographic stations left on the moon prove that there is something strange with the reverberation on the moon. So my question is, do you remain with an impression that he may have been talking about a hollow moon with major installations inside, or it was just a dugout tunnel and underground base, underground city type of a thing that the Earth government have done on the moon?
I kept thinking, you know, when he said under the surface, I couldn't imagine what in the world would be under the surface. Oh, he says there's plenty of room. That seems like there was plenty of room, but I don't remember him saying anything in particular that it was hollow. He says plenty of room. It's like he would tell me up to a point, And when he saw that my gears were in gear, he kind of, if I gave the impression that I almost understood and not fully understood, it was like he would go on. But as soon as I comprehended 100%, then it seems like he would stop. So sometimes it was like a little act between me and him.
Yeah.
So I get more information by saying, "Oh, is this what you mean, or that?" And I knew full well what he meant. You know.
Can we check what is the time of the counter? What the counter is pointing right now? 1 hour and how many minutes? Yeah. 1:41 minutes and 21 seconds. Excellent. We have 20 more minutes, so we will finish at 25. Excellent. Now about his Martian trips, did he elaborate about being on the surface of Mars and inside Mars?
Yeah, he talked about it in the same breath with the moon.
Yeah.
And he says there were several of us that have gone up. I said, did you have to really be something special to be chosen? He says, we're all special. You know.
We were all special. Did he mention how they went there? Did they go there by a rocket, by a spaceship, by a flying saucer? I'm sorry, by some teleportation technology?
Well, at the time, the way he explained to me, it was incomprehensible. It didn't seem to be a mechanical way of going from point A to point B. He says it's incomprehensible.
So this is basically a teleportation explanation that a material object in point A is turned into beam of light and transported to point B where it is materialized.
I just thought of something, and the first thing I said, and I was very liberated, I said, are there women up there too? He says, of course.
You were probably asking about Earth women.
Yes, Earth women, yeah.
Which means that there are families and there are children being born there. And it's a full-fledged colony. It's a survival civilization already established on the Moon and Mars.
Or at least women scientists or whatever they did, you know. I'm sure they didn't have women up there just to serve them coffee like they do in the offices here. Marina would love that.
Being inside Mars, I mean, let's finish off first with the surface of Mars. I remember this fictional film where government agents with the briefcases, with the wood and two-piece suits. They seldom wear three-piece suits. This is more of a British tradition than here. But anyway, this is my little observation as a foreigner. They would go to a teleportation installation and stand upright with the briefcase, and a beam would come, and they would be teleported to different planets. I wouldn't be amazed. Actually, the more I think about these things, the more I realize that this could just be the case, that there is a secret or many government installations where they teleport important people back and forth between the planets, which is not that different anyway. Teleportation from an orbiting saucer to a planet is even more difficult, although the distance is shorter, because teleportation without a receiver station is more difficult. If you have a transmission and receiver station, basically a two-way stations on both ends of the beam, then it is a much simpler game to do. And that the government has established such stations. This was done with Tesla technology probably since the early 50s or 60s, and that they can teleport their important officials not only secretly from Washington to their embassies around the world without exposing them to risk and problems with foreign intelligence services, but to different planets and so on. So did he mention anything about a surface civilization living on Mars, an alien civilization living on Mars?
He seemed to feel, he used the analogy between, you know, the Moon and Mars within the same sentence structure, as if they were simultaneously together, the same bag of tricks. at the same time.
Yeah, because with such planet-to-planet teleportation technology, whether you go to the moon or to Pluto or Neptune, basically it's the same business. It's done in a second, in a split second probably. Now, to the underground of Mars, it's very interesting because Al Bielek and the revelations from him coming through the book, the Montauk Project, which we showed to our audiences in the previous interview we did with Al Bielek, the third underground interview with Al. He was talking of him and his brother, Duncan, going to Mars, inside Mars, into huge underground shelters, underground doomsday shelters that were built by previous Martian civilization, now extinct and no more existing. Shelters so massive, nobody could move the doors on the surface. Nobody could penetrate these on the surface. So what the government did was very simple. They just got the coordinates of the surface coordinates on Mars of the suspected underground structure. Probably they did a lot of scanning with their advanced scanning devices. And then having the coordinates exact, they used the time tunnel technology, which is a lot more advanced than the teleportation technology, to penetrate the underground spaces. And they would send first a camera, television camera, to get the picture, to make sure that they haven't hit a rock, and to make sure that whoever person travels through the time tunnel would not end up embedded in a rock or halfway inside a wall. And after that, they just ended up on the other end of the tunnel, walking out of the tunnel onto these underground spaces. So, I mean, this is another confirmation here that actually the government has been very actively involved in so many areas of research on the adjacent planets that is hard for us to imagine. Any other hints by your father as to similar developments by our government on other planets, not only the Earth and Mars, like our at least visits to Venus, to Jupiter and to other planets, meetings with civilizations there? Or anything about the Star Trek being truth rather than a fiction?
Star Trek, the movie Star Trek.
Yeah.
When I look at Star Trek, now I see that space station that's in there. Now that was almost the exact replica of what I saw in that underground place in 1956.
That was probably a space station that was already built and operational in '56. Which means that I don't think that it is with saucer technology that the Americans captured by the Germans. It was done by saucer technology independently developed here with Tesla technology. I have a feeling that in the early 1900s already saucers were flying around the planet and possibly to the moon. The British would never relinquish, if they went to the moon with their hybrid gun, rocket, and anti-gravity technology, as I've been explaining in one of our videotapes available from us. Then they have been pursuing this with more advanced anti-gravity saucer technology in the early 1900s. Now, when your father materialized to you in your bedroom, what year was that, and how many years after his death was that?
It was a few months after his death, supposed death. It was a Memorial Day weekend in 1962. Now, he died on Lincoln's birthday in 1962, so it was a few months afterwards. March, April, May, a couple months afterwards.
Did he look his age when he materialized to you, or did he look much younger?
He looked exactly like he did when I knew him. Exactly. He even smelled the same. He used Mole shaving cream. He looked exactly the same. still the sparkle in his eye. I do know one thing. He was always testing me with a lot of things, and one of the things he used to always test me with was telepathy, mental telepathy. Even as a small child, he would draw a picture of a tree in the kitchen, and then I would see what he was doing, and then I would do a tree in the living room, this back and forth. So that kind of early training, I had this telepathic path between he and myself. No matter where he was, I knew what he was doing, and we had a very, very strong bond. So I feel no matter where he is, whatever I'm saying now is something that he wants me to do.
Very interesting, very fascinating. I've heard stories that the Germans that dug under the South Pole and built their underground bases before the Second World War ended, and that beat the hell out of Admiral Byrd's naval campaign against them in the winter of '46, the spring of '46, when actually in 2 weeks they downed most of his planes and he retreated in disgrace. This huge German colony there, they moved hundreds of thousands of people before the war ended. By now, I've heard rumors that this was a very mysterious buzz that appeared only over this portion of the tape, inexplicably why. So now I'm basically repeating the story of the German underground South Polar colony. The wildest stories are that there is a city called New Berlin that has 2 million inhabitants, the center of the German colony there. This is what has been developed after the hundreds of thousands of people were moved during the Second World War. The German elite basically lost the European War in order to win the South Polar War, in secretly preparing for 2 years for the awaited American attack, and when it came they beat Admiral Byrd in just 2 weeks with their way more superior technology that they had there. They've been engaged primarily in space exploration, flights in the solar system and beyond, and genetic experiments to create a new super race, a new master race, to create their dreamed supermensch. I've discovered witnesses that have seen German documentary films from the World War II concentration camps of horrific genetic experiments with hybridization between humans and animals, living, walking, breeding hybrids, half human, half animal. So basically for half a century after that, the Germans continued in this direction, and in this large city that they have there underground, the city fittingly called New Berlin, they've been basically evolving the new super race that is quite more advanced and has very little in common with the race that lives on the other part of the planet. It's my intuitive feeling that the tall, blonde aliens, the Nordic type aliens that have been observed in many little gray abduction scenarios, they could as well be Germans coming from their South Polar colony that are doing research together with our government in genetic experiments primarily on the American population in order to create a white Nordic type race. This is my deepest suspicion, and this is one of the biggest secrets of the intelligence community these days. So I don't know, this buzz that appeared on the tape could have been accidental, or it could have been just on the most sensitive place of the whole tape.
If they have books or just magazines. Simple observation, he said. Now, he was not a snob. He loved all people. He says the key to everything is reading. So he would take building blocks, little building blocks, and he put them. I was not allowed to sit on the floor, so I had a card table, and he showed me the first word was Gott, which is God.
G-O-T-T.
Gott, yeah. And of course I wrote everything in German. And before you knew it, he had me quoting Goethe, the Bible, Heinrich Heine, my favorite. My mother would help me with the poetry. I would read reams of poetry. I'm 2 years old. My mother would sit and embroider or sew. She says, read me from Heinrich Heine or whatever you like, you know, your favorite poems. So they were very long, elaborate poems, and it was a lot of practice. Or I'd read the German newspaper or whatever my parents were suggested, which they always suggested what I liked. You know, they knew what I liked. So I learned to read at a very early age. I also learned to write at an early age.
What age were you when you learned?
2.
We can see here some quote similarities with the American public education system. We can imagine the tremendous discrepancies between the special education the children of the elite get and the artificially watered down and moralized education that the general public in America is getting from the public schooling system. It is meant, we can understand obviously, to assure that these that are in control and in power would always remain in control and power, and that very seldom, if really, a person must be really a genius, his soul must be the soul of a genius, in order to overcome the American education establishment, and despite the education he is getting from there, to be able to reach to the highest levels of management and science and technology in this country.
I'll give you a perfectly good example.
We have 5 more minutes here, so I would be glad if you can think of kind of a summarizing or wrapping up thought about, I mean, I've had 2 of the most wonderful hours in my life. Through my brother, who is a born psychologist, I've learned through him to kind of interview people for myself, to open up their book of life and to read through the book and to make them feel special, to feel that you have a sincere interest in them and not the superficial, how are you doing interest. And I'm always amazed at the incredible treasure of information that you can get out of anyone, not only of the special children of the scientific elite, but even of a normal truck driver. I mean, you can talk to a truck driver and get incredible scenes and happenings of his life and so on. But I think the information that we got today here has been so fascinating. Information that one can never read in the papers, that I haven't even imagined has existed.
But you know where you got the information from, Vladimir? You didn't get it from my ear, you got it from my heart. And that's the way you interviewed. I saw the pictures of my life come back, like I'd look away and I'd see the pictures of my life and my father. And I'm doing this, you know, really for the world to know that there are other sides to human beings, and you can't always criticize a person because they're Russian or German or American, or criticize your flag or your country. But once in a while there is this wonderful person that emerges quietly, like my father, and sees the world in a different light, and it affects not only me, it affects my daughter's generations, maybe people that listen to this. There's no such thing as a 2-year-old that can't understand, you know. And I raised my daughter that way, and my grandson is raised that way, and they could read also at age 2.
Fascinating. So I think this whole interview is in memory of your father.
Yes.
What were his 3 names, his full 3 names?
Friedrich August Kueppers, or Friedrich Wilhelm August Kueppers.
In memory of diplom engineer, Herr Diplom Engineer Dr. Friedrich Wilhelm August Kueppers, as would his full German title be? May he live and work in